Good morning and welcome to panel 4 of the African Energy Indaba, where we will discuss the future of oil and gas in Africa in the energy transition. My name is Dave Wright and I'm a board member of SANEA, or as the South African National Energy Association is known. And I have the privilege of being your moderator today. With me, I have an excellent panel. They are Olabode Sowomni, Fani Chufilero, Olabode is from Nigeria. Fani Chufilero is from Sapir. Rashen Reddy is with Carney. John Pizwe is with Shell. Greg Nicholas is with Lesedi, Nuclear Services, and Keith Harvey is with Richards Bay IDZ. I'm not going to give a detailed introduction to each of them, but as we proceed with the format of the panel, I will start with a brief scene-setting intro and then ask each panel member to briefly introduce themselves and then share their views on this topic for about 7 minutes. When the panel is, we've heard each of the panel members, we will then move to a discussion amongst the panel members and then close off for Q&A from delegates that are attending the session. Right, so moving on to start dealing with the topic in hand. Whether we like it or not, or even acknowledge it, the energy transition has already begun. Certainly at a global level. We just have to look at how some of the oil majors are shifting their focus away from oil and gas in order to see how this change is starting to happen. At COP26, a stance was taken that coal is to be phased out by 2050. Now, not everybody was happy with that position because more wanted to see the use of coal stop much sooner. But the question is, if that's what the view is of coal, what about oil and gas? And I think that's the sort of issue that we are going to tackle in our discussion now. It's starting, I think, for people to realize that we can't simply just switch off using oil and gas. In other words, you can't stop using it as quickly as most people would like it to happen, without causing significant economic damage on a global scale. But the question for me then is, does this give us in Africa more time to prepare for the significant reduction in demand for oil and gas that is likely to happen as a consequence of the energy transition? Or are we just kidding ourselves? So with the energy transition in progress, but still in its early days, this then seems a good time for us to now deal with the topic. So at this stage then, I'd like to invite Olabode to share his views on the topic. Olabode, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for the kind introduction. Just as an update, my name is Olabode Sowomni. I'm an engineer. I work with the Senate president of the Senate. We advise him on gas and power. I run an energy consulting firm called Captree, which does advisory services in those areas. And I am an executive within the Nigerian Gas Association, where I'm the vice chair for the Gas to Power Study Group. So in simple terms, without trying to exaggerate anything, I believe that energy as a commodity is probably the most important commodity in the world. Not just because we're involved in that industry, but basically because it is an item and an anthem to life in itself. But more importantly, as we have come to realize, is the fact that energy in the way we use it cannot continue that way if we want the planet to survive. And that is where the concept of sustainability comes in, and that's where the concept of having green energy comes in. There is this divide between what is practical and what is actually theoretical. And while the world is pushing for a strong sustainable energy ethos, it is important to realize that there's a need to actually look at what really can work. Because in the global energy space in itself, we have over 1,000 products that are directly dependent on the oil and gas, from the pens, the ink in the pens, from candle wax, roofing tiles in houses, jerseys that football players wear, the tar that is used to tar the roads for cars to move in, fuel that the vehicles and airplanes use. Just so many things are dependent on that industry. And until there is an alternative that is commercially competitive, so it must first be an alternative and then it must be commercially competitive, those products are still going to be in use. So then there is also the other part of the reality of sustainability of the sustainable energy forms itself, but that's a different discussion. So we now have to look at how do we really play, because we are fighting two extremes here. There is what we call the first extreme of 100% sustainable energy, and there are those who have the 100% fossil fuel, who believe that nothing should change and nothing will change. So we have to find what is possibly a happy medium there. And for the industry, one of the areas that offers a very clear and clean alternative there will be gas. Gas is very low in terms of its emissions, and it offers practically all the things, with some other technology that oil itself can produce. But moving forward, how do we, as a continent, as Africa, actually get our acts together and benefit from each other and leverage on our strengths? I think if there is ever a dictionary definition for the word disconnected, it will be in terms of how African nations connect with each other. Yes, there is the push of and the talk about after, but it's still largely in its early stages and it's not able to give more impact. To put in perspective how disconnected the energy industry is within Africa, you will look at a country like Nigeria that has significant amount of oil, significant amount of gas. Nigeria exports virtually all of our gas outside the continent, as far back as Asia in most cases. And I believe in South Africa, some of her own gas is gotten from the US. Why would you have two major economies on the continent not even talking to each other? And it doesn't require too much intelligence for you to realize that it will cost cheaper if the gas was bought from Nigeria, and it probably will cost Nigeria less in terms of expenditure. But that is also the economic impact it will have across both continents. But we can't just be picking it piecemeal and talk about this nation exports gas or this nation is not exporting gas. There needs to be a plan. And that is why there is a need for an energy policy and energy plan that will cover the regions, SADC, ECOWAS, North Africa, East Africa, but more importantly, on the strength of the policies that will come from the regions, there must be an economic policy and plan that will cover the continent. Because without a plan for the continent itself, there will not be a genuine ethos in terms of what we want to do or how we want to go about what we need to do. The issue, without a doubt, is that the continent is rich in energy, and it actually has the genuine capacity to become energy independent as an interdependent group of nations. And when I mean energy independent, I mean energy independent of the rest of the world. As at today, there is no nation, even the US, that is totally energy independent. For some, they have the abundance of the raw materials or the raw sources, but they are not able to refine it as it should be. And all of these can change if we as an African continent, if we as nations within Africa can speak to ourselves and get the reality of what is important out. The third thing I want to add is that while sustainable and green energy is nice, it may not necessarily be the first input that we should look at, primarily because of the cost and the sustainability of it. But more importantly, because Africa as a continent needs energy and needs a lot of energy to develop and even sustain the current life forms that it has. When a patient is sick, the first option is to get the patient well. Then you are now start talking about the best medicine or allergies that is reactionary to. Most of the world developed on the foundation and the back of fossil fuels. There is no need and no reason why Africa's development will be tried on the path of sustainability. I think, thank you. Let me stop at this point.
Thank you very much, Olabode, for that expression of views from your side. We really do appreciate it. Keith, can I move on to you, please?
Thanks, Dave. Hi, everybody. I'm Keith Harvey. I'm Legal Manager Company Secretary for the Richards Bay Industrial Development Zone. However, the reason I'm here is I have been a member of the Oil and Gas Lab for Operation Pakisa since basically first started. And I was also the chairperson of the Oil and Gas Hub Study Steering Committee that was conducted by the Richards Bay Industrial Development Zone. So it's sort of a little bit of my background in the oil and the gas industry. Dave, the questions that you pose are very interesting, and the way that we deal with it going forward with regard to oil and gas and what the approach is going to be over the years. I think we've got to look first at segregating oil and gas because there are different dynamics that apply to each of them. In regard to oil, at the moment, I think the majority of oil that we are utilizing is in the transportation industry. But as Olabode correctly pointed out, there are dozens of other products that are derived from oil. So you're probably likely to see far less oil going into the transportation industry. I mean, heavy fuel oils already had this problem in the shipping industry. Particularly once you get Europe with their, no internal combustion engines after 2030 in some countries. You're going to find far less use of oil, particularly in the transportation industry. I'll come back to that and how it's going to affect Africa, because I think we're going to have a slightly different scenario. With regard to the other uses of oil, the plastics, the roof tiles, the chemicals, the everything else from oil, it's a question of, do we have alternatives? Are they reliable and cheap? And do we simply leave this valuable resource just lying in the ground simply because we don't want to use it anymore, when there may be methods to process it in such a way that we still get the benefits of what comes out of oil, but without the carbon emissions? So I think we're going to be looking more at oil turning more to the chemical side, the plastic side, less to the transportation side. With regard to gas, I think it's a completely different scenario. Gas, we've got this issue at the moment that people are trying to move to renewables. Renewables have a huge problem. I mean, there was an article that appeared in one of the publications here in South Africa some time back that was saying at the evening peak, South Africa has a total capacity available of 5,350 megawatts, give or take. At the evening peak, the amount of power that was available from wind and solar, both PV and the other one, was in the region of 911 megawatts. So you're looking at about 1/5 of the total capacity. Now, at present, battery technology just isn't there. And the only option that you then have is gas. There's literally nothing else that can be utilized to fill the gap between electricity demand and what is available from renewables. I mean, the fact is solar just doesn't work at night. Until batteries get to a stage, and well, they might within the next couple of years, particularly given the speed of development, then there's this possibility of something happening. But until then, we've got to go with gas. It's the only option we have, unless we all want to load shed every night forever and ever. I mean, 5 o'clock turn off your power because load shedding's come because we've run out of renewables. The second thing that we've then got to look at with regard to gas is its future use also. I mean, everyone's talking about the hydrogen transition. You're talking about blue hydrogen comes from gas. So you've got another sort of source of blue hydrogen going forward. And it's not something you sort of just want to abandon because it's gas. So I see gas as having a far better future, so to speak, particularly in its current usages, than I would see for oil. With regard to Africa and the use of oil, I see us being sort of much longer than 2030. South Africa has this problem because we export a lot of vehicles, so we've got to make cars available for markets where we can sell them. And if we continue to produce internal combustion engines, we're going to have a problem selling cars, particularly Britain, France, and the countries that are saying no more internal combustion engines after 2030. So we have to do something there. But if you look how it is now, there are already 600 million people in Africa who don't have access to grid electricity. Tell them to put that, how are you going to power your electric car? It's not going to happen. You've got this fleet of cars that are already on the road. You're not going to get rid of them anytime soon. We don't have the same pressure, I don't think, that you would have in certain of the countries in Europe to move away from the internal combustion engine. And I see Africa and possibly South America at the end of the day becoming the last refuge of the internal combustion engine. We can almost get to the point of having, for petrol heads, come to Africa, do a tour and actually drive a V12. Or even drive a straight four for that matter. So I definitely see that there will be the internal combustion engine and use of petrol in Africa for a much longer time. And if you look at what happened at COP26 with Toyota, Volkswagen, Kia, Hyundai, Stellantis, and Renault-Nissan, all of them have basically said, that 2050 target's not achievable. And I think they look primarily looking at the Africa-South American market as a place where we're not going to be doing, not everybody's going to be doing electric cars by 2050. So in regard to sort of the summary of what you're saying, I still see a future for gas. Even the long term, maybe as a transitional fuel, but certainly in the short to medium term, we're going to still be doing gas for a very long time. Something's got to replace coal. If you're going to reduce carbon emissions and you're currently burning coal, gas is a heck of a lot better than coal for carbon emissions. So that's the first thing. Gas has got a good future. Oil, I think, less so in transportation, but we still need that natural resource as feedstock for other things. So we're still going to be using oil in the longer term, maybe a little bit less, particularly worldwide, quite a lot less, Africa, a bit less in regard to the transportation industry. But certainly there will still be a role for oil. Thanks, Dave. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Keith. Appreciate your input. Can we then move on to Hloniphezwa, please? Your views, please.
Thank you, Dave. Good day, everyone. My name is Hloniphezwa Dolo. I'm the country chair for Shell companies in South Africa. Specifically, I look after the downstream business as the head of that business. I also look after our refining asset as a board member of SAPREF. I am the current chairperson of SAPIA, and I look after our mobility business at Shell. I also sit on a number of other business leadership roles in South Africa, like Business Leadership South Africa. So, Dave, the conversation is actually quite heating up in terms of the role of oil and gas in Africa. So, meeting growing global demand for energy while tackling climate change and pollution, as agreed in the Paris Agreement, is a fundamental challenge facing society and one that we must deliberate about to ensure our sustainability. Our collective approach to this challenge needs to be balanced to the tension between how we achieve a cleaner environment, security of electricity supply, and affordability. As Shell, we have been very clear about our achieving our global net zero carbon target by 2050. Africa has abundant potential for renewable energy. However, grid stability is a key requirement to unlock the renewable energy opportunities. Whilst the renewable energy opportunities progress, there are urgent requirements for reliable, cleaner energy sources that can stabilize our grids and address some of immediate needs, especially in South Africa. The South African government's risk mitigation independent power producer procurement program and the expected 3 gigawatt RFP are intended to reduce the electricity shortfall that the country currently is facing, predominantly through the use of LNG. If we look at South Africa specifically, the integrated 2019 resource plan, by way of an example, it has laid out the plans for a long-term diversification of energy mix by 2030. In an effort to reduce the energy sector's carbon footprint whilst addressing current and future energy demands. It is paramount, therefore, that we do also do this while ensuring a socio-economic just transition. Renewables contribute to the electricity mix in the form of wind and solar. This has grown from 2.5% to 6.2% over the past 5 years. Though positive, this contribution still notably falls below the global average of 9.4%. And this must be increased. As Shell, we firmly believe that gas has a critical role to play in South Africa in the just energy transition that we are talking about. Gas has perhaps an almost unique advantage in that it can be used in all sectors of the economy. That is power, that is transport, industry, and the built environment. Gas will provide an alternative for our coal customers as it has been said by Keith and demonstrated in his speech that gas has a critical role to be playing in this sector. Natural gas also pairs well with renewables, as we need an energy source that is available, reliable over a longer term, especially when conditions are not ideal for wind and solar power generation. We firmly believe that at present, there is no alternative dispatchable electricity supply solution to natural gas that can support renewable energy to commercial scale. I think Keith has articulated this very well, and we actually support his views quite strongly. Our country continues to be significantly impacted by load shedding and power disruptions. These are hampering our economic progress and negatively impacting on people's lives. We have seen extreme cases where electricity supply impacts the supply of water, thus impacting on health facilities. At present, our country is highly dependent on coal. Oil and gas, therefore, is going to be playing a huge role going forward. This means that as we transition to a lower and eventually a zero carbon emissions future, we need to continue to provide the energy South Africa needs today. Finding resources offshore could significantly contribute to our energy mix, as well as contribute to the government's economic development programs, whilst providing many local jobs, job opportunities. If South Africa can find its own supply of offshore gas, it could play a key part in changing our country's energy mix. Thank you, Dave.
Great. Thanks so much, Hlonipizwa. I appreciate your input and your thoughts. Some interesting common themes coming out with our first three panelists here in terms of punting the gas option. So let's hear what Greg has to say. Greg, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. I'm probably a little bit different from others in that I'm actually a bit of a layman when it comes to oil and gas, in that I'm not directly involved in the sector of extracting these commodities and using them within the overall environment. Just out of interest, the largest commodity traded in the world is oil. So that's not going to change overnight. So I think, to echo some of the comments of others, I do believe that oil and gas are here to stay for a while still. There's no immediate alternative solution. But I do believe that if we just take a little bit of a step back and reflect back 10 years on the energy sector and the power generation sector in general in South Africa and globally, and then we think of where we are today, with the power generation and the energy sector as a whole is going through a revolution. It's not an evolution, it's actually a revolution. And we see of the development that's happening in the sector, the technology advancements that are occurring, and the increased demand by the public, by consumers, by others, to move away from carbon-intensive energy sources. It's going to continue to drive the revolution. Where it's going to be in 10 years' time, I have no idea, but it's definitely going to be substantially different to where we are at the moment. And I think it would be naive to think that it's going to be business as usual for the oil and gas sectors, and that we can continue to extract it, sell it, and that the revenue will continue to pour into the coffers. However, I do believe that the transition will take time. And then there's a little bit of a dichotomy of requirements on the African continent as well, in the fact that we have, as many have said, we have huge resources within the country, within the continent, in terms of oil and gas and other fossil fuels. But we also have minimal installed baseload power generation, grid scale type power generation, and that needs to be developed rapidly. So there's an opportunity to, instead of other regions which are more developed, where they have already an install base based around fossil fuels, there is an opportunity in Africa where all new energy has some form of renewable component to it. However, Keith made the very valid point, is that at present, renewables are no answer for baseload electricity. And come 8 o'clock at night in the middle of August in South Africa, when we're experiencing the depths of winter, we all want to boil the kettle and what have you. We want electricity on tap straight away, and we are not really interested in where it comes from at the moment. But I do believe that there are other opportunities. I do believe that gas has a place to play in the sector as a complementary supply and a complementary solution to renewables. It doesn't have to be one or the other. I do believe that they can complement one another, and that the opportunity to increase the number of baseload and hybrid type power generation solutions in Africa is definitely the way to go. Also, the fact that we need to develop so much new power generation to power the whole of Africa gives us an opportunity to possibly start with a blank sheet of paper, which can hopefully ensure that it is far less carbon intensive. My final comment comes to those people that say that, you know, the first world and the Northern Hemisphere developed its economies off a carbon base. And so the fact that they did it, you know, we now should have the right to do it ourselves. I think that's a little bit of a blinkered view. It's similar to saying, well, we're all sitting in a boat. One person caused a hole in the boat, so it's his problem to make sure that we plug the hole and bail the water so that we do not sink. If we're not all part of the solution, the problem is going to affect all of us, and we're all going to suffer the consequences. I'll end off there.
Thanks very much, Greg. Good point made at the end there. If we look at where climate change is going to have the biggest impact, it's unfortunately here in Africa, I understand. So although we may have the smallest contribution to emissions at the moment, if we don't play the game as well, it's going to be difficult to get the support we need to make the change that we need to make. Right, Fonny, let's move on to you, if you don't mind. Can we have your views on this lot? Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dave. Good afternoon. Let me start by extending the warm regards, and thank you to Africa Energy Indaba for inviting SAPIA to participate in this panel. As the moderator has indicated, my name is Fanny Chifularo. I'm with the South African Petroleum Industry Association, SAPIA. You heard earlier on that my boss is on the panel as well here, the chairperson of SAPIA, so I have to be on my best, right now. Dave, just maybe to concur with you, indeed, the transition has begun. And I think just to concur with Greg, that, we all need to be part of the solution. It's not something that we can relegate to some other people to deal with. It is about the future of this country, in particular South Africa, and the future of the entire world, for us to do something about reducing the emissions, global emissions. So as the association SAPIA, we do recognize that we've got the responsibility towards transition to low carbon economy, to the levels well below 2 degrees Celsius. This will be the pre-industrial limits. And this transition, as is already indicated by the other speakers, it needs to be cognizant of the development nature of our country. We've got the issues that, socioeconomic issues that we are tackling as a country, whether you're talking about the need to create sustainable jobs and also contribution to the reduction in energy poverty that is really in Africa experienced by a large proportion of the population. I think we can't just ignore all these challenges that we're facing as the players in the sector. We need to do something to partner with the authorities as well. But the energy transition is not something that's new. It's something that is already on the go, as the moderator has indicated as well. So we are not starting from scratch. I think one of the areas that we need to sense too is to look at the UN sustainable goals, the ones that are relevant to the energy transition. If you look in particular to goal number 7, which talks about the provision of affordable and clean energy, we need to expand on the work that has started along that goal. Then you've got goal number 12 that looks at the responsible consumption and production. And then the last goal that we have identified as the association that we should also look at is the goal number 13, which is about climate action. So this gives us a platform to really accelerate the efforts that have gone into making sure that we make progress in terms of sustainable development goals. There is acknowledgement that the energy transition itself is not going to be easy. It is going to be a challenging task, or it is a challenging task, but it is possible. And based on what we see in terms of the various numbers that have been published by various agencies, like you look at the International Energy Agency and other similar agencies, they do show a picture that in the future, the demand or the need for energy requirements in our continent or worldwide, if you have to look at the entire picture, it will double what we see today. So the challenge that we have is how do we continue to meet that demand while we are looking at further reducing the emissions in order to meet the aims of Paris Agreement, while at the same time we are paying special attention to the role of hydrocarbons, at the same time looking at the energy mix to meet the requirements of the demand of the future. the oil and gas sector, it will have to play a critical role in the transition phase, and more so we see that, that role is not going to just disappear. It will still be there at the end state. Maybe for now, if we talk about 2050, the oil and gas will still be playing a significant role around that period. I think one of the issue, as my last point, Dave, we think we'll need, because this has to be a partnership. In other words, we'll need an effective policy environment that will allow the market to drive innovation, and it will allow for the development and deployment of the necessary infrastructure to transform the energy system at least cost. This will include, proper statutory reporting and verification of emissions, because that's the only way we can see if we are making progress. And then we'll need to have appropriate price on carbon, because we need to change the behavior of the users of our products and avoiding carbon leakage. But as a last resort, maybe we need to also allow for the use of appropriate carbon offsets in order to meet the emission objectives. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Fonny. Interesting that you brought in the SDGs. They certainly are a means for us to use to guide what we need to do. Right then, Prashen, last but by no means least, your views, sir.
Thank you, Dave, and hello, fellow panelists and the audience out there. Prashen Reddy, I'm a partner at Kani. I lead our work on the African continent in relation to the energy and process industry sector. I'm also a director at the South African National Energy Association, SENIA, where Dave is also a fellow board member. I think I agree a lot with what has been said, and that's the advantage of going last, I guess, with some of the thinking that's already been placed by the panel. I think what's important to maybe acknowledge is the starting point of Africa is different to the starting point of many other parts of the world. And our journey, therefore, will look different. In supporting, I believe, the transition, which we will form part of in Africa, to solve some of our socioeconomic challenges, but also we are the least industrialized continent in the world. We're going to have to consume more energy, we're going to have to consume more chemicals, we're going to have to consume many other products that come from the sources of oil and gas as is seen today. So it's almost a very different journey that has to be followed. That being said, I do believe that the continent is going to follow a different transition to the rest of the world, given that our needs in energy has already been discussed. We are far behind where the rest of the world is. But also, I think that the sectors will take a very different take. So if you look at the oil and gas definition of, or broader definition of energy and its contribution to the world, I think has been covered by some of your panelists. Transport, industrials, electricity, agricultural, commercial, residential, waste, all of these sectors are not going to follow the same path in the energy transition. I think what is very clear is that renewables will play a very active role in helping the electricity sector reduce its emissions and impact in the environment. But when you start to look at the broader applications of oil and gas, you start to notice that renewables cannot solve the problems of industrials and chemicals players. It can't solve the problems of agricultural and other commercial uses. And therefore, we need to start to think a little bit more differently about those sectors. And here's maybe where my point would be slightly different, or something that we need to think about in Africa, is that this is an opportunity. As these sectors start to reinvent themselves and become relevant in the energy transition, the chemical sector, the use of green ammonia, green methanol, as we start to evolve away to more sustainable fuels and advanced fuels and chemicals in the industrial space, what is Africa's role going to be in that? And how do we continue to support the development of new skills, capabilities, and industrialization on the continent to allow for that to happen? So I do believe that it is also an opportunity, as the whole world is currently reinventing and establishing new industrial sectors to support the energy transition. we should not shy away from that. We should be at the forefront of green hydrogen, as has already been discussed at length on the continent. The opportunities we have in solar and renewables to produce hydrogen is significant and is competitive with what is happening in the rest of the world. And I think that we cannot ignore that. I also agree that gas is certainly going to be a transitionary hydrocarbon. It is one of the only hydrocarbons that is expected to grow going forward in its demand. And we will continue to see the use of gas. And as the panelists already pointed out, you still need the use of this hydrocarbon to substitute baseload and provide a consistent electricity supply until you have the scale of storage of electricity to the levels where we can support the grid effectively. So in that way, gas will continue to play its role. There are many projects that have already reached FID, close to FID in the region with an abundance of gas available. And we cannot ignore what that is going to mean for the next 10, 20 years, 30 years within the continent's context of development. I also agree with the panel on the point of Africa's industrial support base coming from Africa itself. So as we industrialize, supporting our own needs is going to require, of course, oil and gas in that transition. And of course, the more progressive nations in Europe might not be having high demands of these commodities anymore, but will need that demand within the continent to satisfy our own development and growth and industrialization. Maybe lastly, just to conclude, I think one thing we've got to be aware of is there's two elements that are going to, from an external perspective, contribute to how the journey unfolds in Africa. One is funding. And it's very clear that financial institutions, DFIs, the scale of investors have become very active in the space of where they will invest and where they will not invest. There's still hope for gas, but it looks like a lot of investments are starting to be deferred in the other spaces of coal and oil. And we will have to figure out how to appropriately fund these large capital programs if we want to continue to exploit our resources effectively. Otherwise, it's unfortunately not going to work. And the other piece is around the Scope 3 regulations that Europe is pushing for, which is if you're familiar, the regulations in Europe, of course, are classified in 3 scopes. And the third scope has to do with the supply of products into any value chain into European markets. So even if you're producing a car in South Africa, if that car was produced using Eskom's electricity, which is sourced from 80% of a coal base, that has an implication for the buyer in Europe in terms of carbon tax. This is going to continue to grow in other regions of the world, in mature markets, therefore impacting export supply chains. And I think we have to start to think about how we continue to of course, not disrupt those supply chains and come up with solutions that will allow us to still export the variety of products. And that's going to include the mix of gas and renewables to allow that to happen. So maybe I'll pause there, Dave, with some of the points that I've made, yeah?
Great, thanks, Mshen. Interesting that you picked up on let's call them non-transportation aspects of oil and gas, as Lesedi kicked off with. So we started with it, we rounded off with it. Very good points made. And your final 2 points about the DFI, or the funding availability and the impact of the EU regs on any product X, a country using carbon-based ways of manufacturing, are going to present Africa with some challenges. Gentlemen, thank you very much for all your comments and your thoughts. What's come out of our discussions very clearly is that I think everybody's saying that gas is going to be important in the future going forward. One of the challenges I anticipate, though, with gas, though, is the cost of the infrastructure and the risk of that infrastructure then becoming redundant at some point in time. How does Africa and perhaps how does South Africa deal with this challenge of introducing gas as an important player in the whole energy mix, without running into the challenge of having redundant assets at the end of it. Any thoughts, any ideas? Yes, Prashen.
Thanks, Dave. I'm using the manual hand raising process. But I guess what can be learned is what's happening elsewhere in the world. So there is definitely a shift to utilize existing natural gas infrastructure for hydrogen. This is starting to already happen in Europe in pipeline infrastructure. We also start to see the use of liquefied hydrogen production as well as transportation across the world, which is also going to give rise to the use of LNG infrastructure that is already in place to of course import natural gas into various parts of the world. So transporting the gas molecule may shift from being pure natural gas to the inclusion of hydrogen in the future economy. I think what will happen is that many investors into these kinds of projects are going to ask those questions. How will this infrastructure be extended in its life and continue to be used as we shift, beyond the typical use of gas infrastructure? And I guess the other piece, of course, is a lot of gas infrastructure comes with long-term offtake agreements. Those don't just go away, unfortunately, well, maybe fortunately. And of course, a lot of them are tied maybe to power or industrial supply for heating or chemicals production. And if that's the case, those, of course, also don't just go away. There will be a phase out of it. But I guess for me, what I've noticed and what we've been observing in other parts of the world, they also have stranded natural gas assets, as you would imagine, as they shift away from gas. There is obviously the option of what's going to happen with hydrogen as a carrier and as a future energy technology.
Thanks, Prashen. Keith, you had your hand up. Greg, I'll come to you after Keith.
Thanks, Dave. I fully agree with Prashen. I think we've got to look at the route of natural gas turning into hydrogen down the line or down the pipe, so to speak. I think if we were to work, we've got to plan for that. I mean, a power station that using a turbine wouldn't take too much to move from natural gas to hydrogen in the long term. If we are not going to hydrogen, what are we going to? That's the next question. Because if you're going to say natural gas and transition, what are you transitioning to? I mean, you've basically got a choice between hydrogen and batteries for some purposes, and it won't cover for all purposes. So I fully agree. I don't see those assets becoming, a gas pipeline, whether you run natural gas in it to hydrogen into still a gas pipeline, a power plant, whether you run natural gas or hydrogen in it is still a power plant. So for a lot of the purposes, I see that there will still be uses for those assets, and they won't sort of fade away overnight. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. Greg, your view?
Yeah, Dave, I think the bigger question is how are we going to get that infrastructure built in the first place? We should have had gas infrastructure, proper gas infrastructure in this country a long time ago. And hopefully market forces will be so strong that that gas infrastructure will be built sooner rather than later. And I think it will be designed, built, funded based on the fact that, yes, potentially it does have a limited lifespan, but that's not, it's not short term. It's definitely medium term to possibly long term as we stand at the moment, as has been mentioned by many others. As we stand here at the moment, there's not that much of an alternative to removing fossil fuels completely in the very near term. So I think the infrastructure will still be in use for quite some time. The options to transition it into being used for other fuels or other uses is definitely something that can be done. We're already seeing Eskom looking at ways of reinventing some of their coal-fired power stations into alternative sources of energy, combining gas with renewables, etc. So I think the bigger question we should be answering is how quickly can we get that gas infrastructure into the country so that we don't have a constraint on gas supply and we don't have peaks and unnecessary price increases owing to constraints in supply.
Thanks, Greg. Hello, buddy. You're muted, sir.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I want to do a little bit of a drawback. I think there's an assumption that when we say something is green energy, it has absolutely no carbon footprint. And that may not exactly be true. I mean, even if you take solar panels, there are a number of items on the solar panels that are plastics, and some of it come from directly the oil and gas industry. I mean, the same applies to wind energy. But in the terms of batteries, when you look at the components of a battery, you have minerals like lithium, like cobalt. I mean, if you visit a cobalt mining site, the impact of that on the society is probably 100 times that of an oil field. So green energy, when you look at the carbon footprint of green energy, is not exactly zero. And I think the discussions have not been had enough on that. Because when we get to the situation where we want the world to get to, where everything is totally going to be dependent on batteries, how much of cobalt, how much of lithium are we going to use to get to that? But that's a totally different discussion. But now, moving further, when we talk about hydrogen, sometimes the devil is in the details, and we need to look at some of the fundamentals. As at today, the energy that is required to produce hydrogen is more than the energy that the hydrogen itself provides. So hydrogen itself, in terms of the technology used to provide it today, is not yet commercially competitive. So rather than talking just about moving into hydrogen, I think one of the first things we need to look at is a technology that will produce hydrogen at a commercial rate, and that's something that will be competitive and realistic. But what we seek to do and get ourselves ready for the future, we don't have to disappear from the present. And that is why some of the things that we are doing now, we need to actually do it well. And that is why the infrastructure will come in. A couple of years ago, there was this discussion about the Trans-Saharan gas pipeline, which was supposed to provide gas from Africa to Europe, which will have been a competition to whatever the Russians are providing to Europe at present. If that had been completed, not only will it be a good source of foreign exchange, it's also a leverage in terms of global politics. So Europe is in crisis now because of gas. I'm sure most of the people on the streets of Europe are not looking at hydrogen or are looking at what will happen in the next 20 years. So it is important, it is vital, it is necessary that we plan for the future, but it is equally important that we don't lose focus on the present while trying to prepare for the future. So that's my input there. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Fani, Hlonipiwe, any points from you?
Yeah. So.
Hlonipiwe.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
sorry,
I
Fani.
think. Sorry, Penny. I think I'm in agreement in terms of the thinking is that if you look at the timeline between now and any time when the other sources of energy will be commercially viable, it's a long lead time. So in terms of investments, the investments that are being put in place now, to Greg's point of saying that, can we accelerate investing in the pipelines and the gas infrastructure? So if we accelerated that, but the infrastructure will be such a way that the return on its investment will be realized over the time period. And when that time comes, as other colleagues have put it out, is that we will have to repurpose the infrastructure. And repurposing the infrastructure, we need to be innovative in terms of thinking ahead of how and what will we be repurposing the infrastructure for. So for me, there isn't a huge need of a huge worry that the assets will be stranded. The thing that is needed is innovative thinking, but innovative thinking today of mapping out the future, that here is where we're going, and from point A to point B, this is what it will take, and from point B to point C, how will we be moving along? Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Hlonipiwe. Fani?
Yes, just to add, I mean, I think we should really ask ourselves a question to say, what is that really we are fighting? What is the enemy here? I think we are all aiming to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. That's what we are aiming for. And if that is the objective, it means we must support like a broad-based approaches to emissions like abatement. I mean, while recognizing that there are various pathways of achieving the net zero greenhouse gas emissions, I mean, over a period of time. And the previous speaker has said, we need to look at some of the things that we're doing today to do them better. By doing them better, it means make sure that we reduce the level of emission from some of the processes that we have today. That is the only way that we can set ourselves on a better path for the future. In other words, if we will look at the initiatives that are in place now, we're talking about the rollout of natural gas and everything else. How do we plan that as we're doing that, we do it better while we recognize that we've got a bigger objective to transition to end up with something like a net zero picture by 2050. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Fani. Appreciate that. We need to think about starting to draw the discussion to a close, but I've got one question that I'd be very interested in your responses to, if I may. And that is, will the current high oil and gas prices that we're seeing on a global basis accelerate the transition? What are your views? And I'm happy to start with whoever would like to start. Yes, Greg.
Once again, I think market forces will dictate as to how things move forward. And definitely high energy prices via fossil fuels in the form of oil and gas prices will definitely accelerate the move towards other forms of energy. If oil was still sitting at $50 a barrel and gas at $2 or $3 a gigajoule, we would definitely see far more use of those energies and far more reluctance to move away from them. But the fact that they are actually hitting the bottom line will definitely accelerate all organizations to look at alternatives because it's actually hitting their bottom line. We're seeing in many instances, there's a desire to look at alternative solutions and work towards projects and implement renewable solutions. But unless they make economic sense, that desire remains nothing more than a desire. There needs to be an economic drive to ensure that there's a move away move away from fossil fuels, and that economic drive will be the high energy cost in using those. And I think those energy costs are not only going to be related to the actual cost of oil per barrel or gas per gigajoule, but it's also the hidden costs of doing business and using those types of energy sources as opposed to less intrusive and less harmful energy sources.
Thanks. Great. Thanks, Greg. Olabode, and then I'll come to you, Keith.
Okay. I think energy as a commodity, and in this case, crude oil as a commodity, will obey all the laws that affect all commodities. I mean, it will fluctuate in price based on issues that surround demand and supply. I think the factors that are driving acceleration towards renewable energy are not necessarily economical. They are more of survival. So it's not because there's a new technology, a certain technology development. It's not because it is economically proven. It is just because there is a thinking or an accepted thinking that it is necessary for us to move out of how we currently use energy as we speak. So it does not matter whether crude oil becomes $10 or it is $200, there will always be a move towards sustainability. But what is important, as we have always said, is that we are not caught napping in the whole issue. So in reality, we don't really need to be bothered about some of the dynamics, but just to keep our eyes on the ball in terms of what we are doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Olabode. Keith?
Thanks, Dave. I think my fear is that as you're getting these public reactions, it will become more and more difficult for the energy companies to explore and determine new reserves, which means that over the long term, your supply is going to diminish, which means your price is going to go up, which will, shall we say, help stimulate alternatives.
Good. A very good point, Keith. Fonny, you had your hand up?
Yes. So, Dave, the other thing that we need to remember is that oil prices, they go up and down anyway. So as much as people can overreact over a period of time, you can't take long-term decisions, especially when it comes to the oil and gas sector on the basis of a shift in the oil price. But at the same time, I'm looking at the vehicle technology. It cannot just be switched over a period of time very quickly like that. If you think about it, they say, in the case of South Africa, probably it's almost the same in the entire continent. If you buy a vehicle today, the chances is that that vehicle will still be on the road in the next 15 years. So in other ways, we don't change, the vehicle technology very quickly. You look at the people who have got access to the electric vehicles in South Africa. The other day I was driving, I saw a BMW in front of me, so I was wondering what car is this? Then I Googled it very quickly once I stopped. I see the car, it cost 1.6 million rands. So I asked myself, how many people in South Africa can afford a car like that? So we need a massive sort of change in terms of vehicle technology if we want to really move the vehicle technology to something else. You look at something like hybrid. As you know, a hybrid is just an improved vehicle. So that hybrid vehicle, it requires the clean fuels. It will need a Euro 5 equivalent fuels. So it's so difficult to think that we're going to just react to a small reaction in the market, to a small dynamic in the market, and we think we can make long-term policy on that basis. We need to look at this as a long-term journey as opposed to reacting to the market forces. Thank you.
Thanks, Fonny. That's very helpful. Prashin, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Completely agree with the points raised as well. Just to also highlight, and those of us that have worked across the integrated value chain of oil and gas know that even in a high oil price environment, it creates a lot of opportunity for investment in the upstream space. The returns and the technology start to look far more attractive, and we've had high oil prices before in the past. We haven't decided to switch technologies on just that basis. And so I completely agree with the sort of discourse around it. But I also think that the higher oil prices will enable further investments as well into the oil and gas space as they create better returns for investments in oil and gas.
Thanks, Prashin. Greg, any comments?
Yeah, so just to pick on what has already been said, I think as the public and as a collective, we need to buy in the fact that this is a transition. It's not a switch. And we need to really understand deeply what this means. So the other forms of energies, or the forms of energies that we have got employed now, they are required for the needs of today. And if we start rushing on the renewables when they are not commercially sensible at this stage, will indeed push up the prices of the sources that we have available at this stage. And therefore, we need to be very careful, and we need to have a deeper understanding of the transition in totality. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Hlonipizwe. Greg?
Yeah, just to close out my initial comments, and from the comments that I said, yeah, I think the high oil and gas prices will be a catalyst to further develop alternative solutions. Yes, I do agree that there will also be a catalyst to possibly develop further exploration around oil and gas. We've seen what's happened with Shell off the coast of Namibia recently, Total off the coast of Mossel Bay. So exploration is still going to take place. There's still going to be people that are hunting a return on investment, no matter where it comes from. But I do believe that from a macro scale, high energy prices in one sector will definitely be the catalyst to technology advancements in other sectors.
Great, thanks, Greg. Well, gentlemen, I think we could spend a lot more time discussing this issue. I'd like to thank you all for your inputs, but I'm afraid I think time has caught up with us, especially if we want to allow some time for Q&A. If I can make a very brief and probably inadequate summary of what I have heard us all talk about today, the transition is going to be a longer process, especially for Africa, than it might be anticipated by lots of people at the moment. And the path that Africa is going to take is going to be very different from the path that other countries are taking, because we're starting from a different position, and the needs for Africa for modern energy are so different. There's so many people that still need access to modern energy. It's very clear from the opinion of the panel that gas is going to be a critical and important player in the future energy mix, and that we don't need to worry about the issue of stranded assets. In fact, what we should worry about is, in the South African context, getting those assets in as quickly as we can. As we follow this different path, one of the things that is, two things that have been highlighted is we need to become more efficient and clever in the way we make the changes. And that means we have to be a lot more innovative. But finally, what we do also need to recognize is that the transition offers Africa opportunities, and we need to take those and make the best of them that we can. So with that, I'd like to draw the panel to a close. And once again, thank you all for your inputs. And let's see what questions we get from our delegates. Thank you so much, gentlemen.